Hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of the Beyond Now webinar here at Porto Business School YouTube channel. Now, regular every Tuesday at 6 p.m., we invite world-class guests and experts to talk about topics and issues that are worrying us during this current day and age, but also thinking of the aftermath of the pandemic, thinking beyond, but thinking about it beyond now. Today, my guest is Pedro Fortuna, the co-founder and CDO of J Scrambler, where he's responsible for setting the vision and technical directions of the company. He leads all the research and development and product development and is responsible for the product roadmap. And previously, he has been a researcher at Ineshtech, and he's one of the most respected experts in cybersecurity in this country. And Pedro has been very active in the last months, engaging with the Tech for COVID-19 movement here in Portugal, a group of founders, of startup founders that got together to, in a community-based approach, prepare and develop solutions and products and approaches that could help different number of situations, that could help citizens, organizations, health professionals, companies to travel this very turbulent road of COVID-19. And within the Tech for COVID-19 movement, one project in particular has been dealt by Pedro in a very direct way. Covidografia, something that I strongly encourage you to take a look at. I've just shared the link with you guys on the chat box. Covidografia gathers information in real time about the symptoms of the Portuguese people to better assess the spread of the pandemic. The collection of data allows users of the platform to follow in real time the symptoms of other users in the same geographic area, based on updates made by themselves. It is, as I have learned from Pedro himself, a symptom tracing app, something different than contact tracing that we will be discussing later. But the discussion is moving worldwide to the topic of contact tracing, and especially how can that can technology help the contact tracing protocols and methodologies that public health has been using. Apple and Google, for instance, have just announced that they will release a joint contact tracing API based on Bluetooth, which never collects any geographic data in order to protect individual privacy, so they claim. However, public opinion and governments have raised concerns about privacy and security issues. For instance, despite all the privacy assurances from Apple and Google, in the UK, for example, the NHS has announced that they are developing their own contact tracing app and that they will not use Apple and Google's API. And right in the beginning of this pandemic, famous historian and writer Yuval Noah Harari wrote an interesting piece on the Financial Times that we have all, in some sense, read or shared parts of it, and he was specifically addressing the topics of the idea that the decisions that we make now will determine how we will get out of this pandemic. And he was raising some concerns and some attention to the issue of privacy versus the use of technology to fight COVID-19. And I'm going to read just a paragraph that I think can be a good introduction to our conversation with Pedro Fortuna. So Yuval Noah Harari wrote, in recent years, both governments and corporations have been using ever more sophisticated technologies to track, monitor, and manipulate people. Yet, if we are not careful, the epidemic might nevertheless mark an important watershed in the history of surveillance. Not only because it might normalize the deployments of mass surveillance tools in countries that have so far rejected them, but even more so because it signifies a dramatic transition from over the skin to under the skin surveillance. Pedro, welcome to our webinar. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Is Harari right, or being concerned about the mass surveillance hypothesis that might be underlying over the use of technologies to in contact tracing, or is this a false assumption?
Well, first of all, Rui, thank you for inviting me and Porto Business School. It's really an honor, and thank you for your kind words. Well, I believe Harari is right, and this is not new. I mean, since 9/11, at least we have been discussing, people that work within the scope of security and privacy, and also society has been discussing whether or not we need to resort to mass surveillance in order to overcome the dangers that we live today, be it terrorism or pandemics. In my opinion, I continue to hold that we should never we should always resist going in through that route. We don't need mass surveillance. We can find other ways. And I see the same arguments returning now that we are dealing with COVID. In my opinion, we are more or less departing from the wrong assumptions. I mean, the discussion is departing from the wrong assumptions. We don't need to give our data to the government or to any entity that represents the government. We don't need geolocation data or tracing people's movement. We don't need to trust the governments or any other entity to not use the collected data for a different purpose. And we don't need to trust the government to whether or not they will be deleting the data after all of this has passed. And why? Because we do have some privacy preserving solutions, or if you will, privacy by design approaches, which pretty much tackle all of these angles and make sure that we don't need to be discussing whether or not we should give our data to the government. There are decentralized solutions that keep all the sensitive data, all the data that can be crossed, and they keep that data on all our devices and not on the single centralized place. There are still some chances that some de-anonymization attacks might be done, but in my opinion, regarding contact tracing, we're talking about corner cases, very complex to execute, very limited to what the attackers can do with it. So in general, it's my opinion that it's quite all right to trust at least the decentralized versions of these apps with our data. And it's not about putting our trust, is about using the right tools.
I've been in my social media, when I was announcing our webinar, I've been trying to get people to understand that we need to focus on facts and not only pre-assumptions or preconceptions that might lead us in wrong directions. And that was the fundamental reason why we needed you on board here today with us to help us figure this out. But let's navigate through this. Contact tracing is not a new concept, right? This is something that public health has been using. The main issue now is that we might be using digital technologies to enhance contact tracing, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, so manual contact tracing is something that every country is using and will keep using. Usually, in the first stages of a pandemic, we will track all the transmission chains. You will interview every person to know whether or not they have been in contact with people and who, and it all relies on the person memory, on the person knowing how to contact those persons they have been with, and sometimes the people don't even remember or know how to contact those persons, and there are people that they have been with that they don't even know them or how to contact them. So I think it's all about moving what we are already doing to the digital. We will keep doing the manual. I'm not convinced that this will make obsolete the manual contact tracing. On the contrary, I think it will be complementary, but it will be more effective in some ways.
Just reminding our audience that you can already start putting questions in our chat box. I will be looking at them constantly. We will not have a Q&A part. No, we will make this a flowing conversation. People's attention has been drawn mainly in terms of what contact tracing is, and confusing contact tracing with the apps that allow for contact tracing by the use and the applications that have been developed in Asia, especially in China. And can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know you have been analyzing them, and what kind of solutions have they implemented in Asia, in particular in China, and what did they do well and what did they do wrong? How can we learn from them?
Well, first of all, they have not developed privacy preserving solutions. This means that governments have access to data. Some of these apps, they integrate geolocation information. They will require you to use an application in order to move between areas. So obviously, you can see it. It's easier to control the pandemic if you are an autocratic country that can cross every database and can monitor with precision the location of every citizen and know everything about them. So in that sense, their job is easier. But again, we in Europe we have different culture. We have been pushing and very well for privacy as a fundamental right of every citizen in Europe, and that's really fundamental. And we shouldn't ever consider going back to before we had those laws. So I think these Asian apps, they are examples. And we should get inspiration from those apps, mostly from the privacy preserving features. I mean, we have a few examples. So in Singapore, they started using the Bluetooth contact tracing version and not using GPS. So that was a good move, a move in the right direction. However, the part where they do the tracing, the risk analysis, is done centrally on the server, knowing which citizens we are talking about. So that part, it's not a good example. But luckily, several groups started discussing different approaches and started working on more decentralized approaches to this problem that basically prevents this data from ever reaching a central entity, a server, or the government. And this data is kept on the mobile phones, and it's the other way around. So all the contact tracing and risk analysis is done directly on your phone, so it never leaves the phone. And so I guess
let me just jump in. Sorry, Pedro. Just to put it plain and simple for me. Well, for me to understand. And I've been reading about this. For instance, Apple and Google claim that they are using Bluetooth protocol, and it will be fully decentralized. This centralization, the decentralization, means that we use the data in a decentralized manner. So we use the data individually to drive our behavior according to the data that we are getting from other cell phones. And in the centralized way, the government has access to that information, and it drives their policy designs. Am I right, or most likely I'm wrong? So can you clear me on that one?
So you're basically right. So decentralized solutions are distributed, means that the data that is used by the system is not on a single place. And that's done by design. So by design, we can aim for a decentralized solution. So in this case, the distribution of the data is done across all the mobile phones of everyone. Whereas on the other side, the centralized approaches, they, at a certain point at least, this data is gathered on a central place. And obviously that's the weak spot. That's the spot where someone could potentially abuse that data or de-anonymize that data or have too much access to this data. And so, yeah.
And what do you see that? Well, I can understand how tempting it could be for governments. Let's think about governments with good intentions to having access to this data to design their public policies. But isn't it naive for us to think that in the decentralized approaches, our behavior, our individual behavior, will be driven almost by trust? Do we need to trust the system, or is this a misconception?
Well, in my opinion, is a misconception. At least I believe that if you have to trust anyone, you're already down the wrong path. I mean, that's how people working on these protocols and solutions, they should strive for not having to trust. In fact, they should completely distrust every party out there, because that's the way you try to achieve good privacy preserving designs.
But doesn't it have might not be so helpful, not so helpful in fighting the pandemic in some sense?
Well,
so the trade-off here between the public health design and what?
So actually, so yes, in general, I agree with you, but not necessarily. What I mean with this is you have always the possibility of building into the protocol the gathering of aggregated anonymized information and provide it to some entity that needs it. I mean, one of the working groups, the DP3T, they are working on an option of their solution or their approach where aggregated anonymized data is shared with epidemiologists, so they can study, but in a way that assures that the anonymization of that data is very hard.
You mentioned one of the working groups. There's a few of them, and you have been following and being involved. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that is being done over there? What paths are they analyzing and designing, perhaps?
Sure. I mean, there's I don't know, maybe hundreds of different applications projects being developed. They started grouping themselves into coalitions or working groups. In Europe, we have this working group called PEP-PT. It's called the Pan-European Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing. So this group started working on an interoperable solution for Europe. So initially, we didn't know a lot about the work being done by this group. It has been opening up and sharing what they have been doing. There's another group that I just mentioned before, the DP3T, that was inside PEP. But they basically decided to come out of the PEP group and form their own group because they had a different philosophy on how to implement these type of solutions. Basically, the PEP working group was behind a more centralized approach where people's contacts would be ultimately uploaded to a central server, and the matrix of contacts would be analyzed there. Whereas the DP3T is pushing for a more decentralized, more private solution where the contacts are being analyzed in each one of the mobile phones of the users. Google and App, they in the middle of all of this, they came out with their own approach, which was an important step. Their solution, their API or protocol is similar to DP3T, so more decentralized, more secure. And it's important because they don't foresee their protocol or API to be used in standalone, but rather to be integrated into mobile apps. So I think there's a good alignment between DP3T and Google and Apple's API that will solve another problem, which is to make sure that we can get this application to the largest number of smartphones out there.
So just for our audience to be clear, Apple and Google are not developing an app, they're developing an API that could be integrated in some of the apps that we already have in our iOS or Android systems that could collect some of that data, but in a decentralized way, mobile to mobile in some sense, to help our behavior. This, Pedro, here an interesting question from our audience, from Pedro Matos, about accountability, of course. And again, the issue, who can be held accountable? Bearing in mind recent reports on app flaws, leaked info, or storage doubts, what is the scope of developers and vendors' accountability? And in case of apps using Bluetooth as the Google and Apple API, who would be accountable for security breaches? And not directly on the app, but on the device itself as consequences of Bluetooth security issues?
Well, ultimately, it's whoever is developing the app. I mean, because they need to factor into their threat model that the devices can be breached. So they have to come up with a strategy to protect the app even when the mobile phone is breached. So there are tamper-resistant technologies that can be applied to mobile apps that can, of course, it cannot ensure 100% that the app won't be tampered with or data will be leaked from it, but it can increase the complexity of doing that. Also, the type of data that we store on those apps and how we store it must take into consideration that attackers might be trying to have a go at it. So it should be considering all of that in the threat model, and ultimately the responsibility of setting and working on that threat model is to whoever is responsible for developing this system or this app.
And regarding that, regarding the security issues, what are the possible threats? What are the possible attacks that we can foresee and that need to be on the threat models and so on, and on people's minds?
Well, we already mentioned one, some attacker breaching mobile phones and trying to exfiltrate data. We also need to be on the lookout for de-anonymization attacks. Luckily, this is being discussed in depth in the working groups. So they're figuring out whether or not the protocols allow for de-anonymization attacks and what sort of attacks, and weighing in their possible consequences. I think there are a few techniques that can protect us. Let's say, so the goal of contact tracing obviously is collecting the contacts that we have made in the last few days. Let's say that we only have one contact with one person, and then suddenly we receive some sort of warning that we might have been in risk and we should isolate ourselves. Then it would be possible to do a de-anonymization attack because we only had contact with one person, so it was obvious who that person was. So another a possibility of tackling this would be for the system to send random alerts similar to the one that I just described, to create the benefit of the doubt and to protect the identity of the users. This is just a basic example, not necessarily the best idea, but just to get a sense of the type of things that we can do. Also, we have to worry about side channel attacks. Side channel is gathering information using indirect sources of information. Let's say we know that the app sends a certain amount of data every time the user is infected. The normal use, it sends like 10% that data. When you are infected, let's say it's multiplies by 10 the amount of data that we are sending. So a possible side channel would be to monitor the traffic, and to just by looking at the amount of data, we would realize that this user has just declared that he is infected. So by doing that sort of analysis, people can try to gather information. Again, there are solutions for this. We need to discuss and eliminate this type of side channels from being analyzed and leveraged by attackers.
Pedro, I know that you and your colleagues within the Covidografia project and the overall Tech for COVID-19 movement, you have been working hard also for a possible Portuguese development or technological developments that can support contact tracing. You have been doing a lot of symptom tracing with Covidografia, as we mentioned in the beginning. And for those of you that just joined, do go to the beginning of our chat box where I just shared the link for Covidografia. If you haven't registered and do it, please. It's helpful. It allows us to understand in our geographical area the levels of symptomology. Let's put it like this. But back to you, Pedro. You have been deeply involved in envisioning a possible solution in Portugal, and what would the guidelines be for that solution regarding a technological approach to contact or support to contact tracing? I know that you are very soon to release a few of those guidelines, but can you please share a little bit what is in your mind right now?
Yeah, sure. So we now know that the Portuguese government has commissioned an app that should be ready pretty soon. And even before we were, so the Covidografia group and a few more folks working with us were thinking about identifying some guidelines that we consider to be important to assure that the national app will be effective and will be safe and private. And we are working on a set of guidelines that we'll publish very soon. I can briefly go over some of the ideas that will be included in those guidelines. So starting with the essential stuff, we believe that this app should be decentralized and privacy preserving, or private by design. And for this matter, we think that the DP3T is a good model to start. It needs to be compliant with European privacy laws and our constitution, of course. We believe a privacy impact assessment should be made. This is a special study where we go into depth into the risks to privacy that a system or application can impose. And ultimately, we know that the CNPD, the National Commission for Data Protection, must give this the green light. It should be open source and developed in a transparent way. So we should expect the source code of this application and all its components to be made available to every citizen, because it needs to be scrutinized. We need to make sure that it is indeed following the best practices in terms of being privacy preserving. It must be interoperable, at least across Europe, because we want to, if we are using a system like this, we need to make sure that if we are traveling across Europe, at least the tool will remain effective. The data that we will be storing, either locally on the app or anything on a central server, should automatically expire. So this will be coded into the application. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't wait for a switch or someone to command this. But it should also be feasible as something that can help fight COVID. And I think we haven't discussed this already yet, but I think one of the main questions around contact tracing right now are not related to privacy and technology, at least in my opinion. They are related with how effective this approach can be. And let me just do a parenthesis here. We can get back to the guidelines in a second. This is really important. So initially, like a month ago, there was an article from Science magazine that suggested that contact tracing was effective, but they kind of dismissed some factors that weren't factored into the study, and more or less relate to three things. First is, how many people do we need to be using the app in order for the approach to be effective? We see some references saying that it must be over 60% of the population. There's one study that we from English university that estimated the benefits of contact tracing based on a model, and the R, the rate of transmission of the disease. So right now, Portugal is more or less under 1.0, which means that it's currently controlled. But of course, we need to go back to normal. People need to go back to their everyday lives. So it's expected for this R to grow. And what they find out is that contact tracing always has a positive effect on lowering the R. But the question becomes, how effective in reducing that? In theory, it should make the R go below 1.0 again, but we're not really sure that that will be possible without like over 60% of the population using this. So you have to be careful, and we have to rely on other things as well, like using masks or avoiding social contact that is unnecessary, and etc. Because contact tracing alone might not be enough.
So we don't need to have this idea that if we can implement a successful technological approach to contact tracing that supports contact tracing, that we can lower our guards and everything else. So it has to be an integrated approach, and contact tracing apps will complement in some way, will coordinate with every other efforts that we need to take place, still with a protective gear, with a social physical distancing and so on, right?
And manual contact tracing and everything. I mean, we shouldn't put the bar to contact tracing as a miracle solution, because there's too many questions to answer right now. We said the number of people using the app. There's also the question of false negatives, because let's say people might get infected through surfaces. I mean, someone is in a room and it goes away, and then another person comes in and might become infected due to the virus being on top of surfaces. So contact tracing won't help you in that case, because the apps won't sense each other, and it won't be registered as a contact. And this is a problem also because of asymptomatic people. So asymptomatic people might not be tested at all because they don't have symptoms. So they won't ever register themselves in the app as an infected person. And that won't trigger the process of isolation to people that have been in contact with this person. And
Pedro, let me just throw in here, because there's a question from our audience that might connect with this thing, and I know that we are having a long parenthesis on the guidelines. We'll go back to it. But André Valente is asking, and how can symptom tracking and contact tracing work together? Should they be in the same app? Can they be effective if they work together? And you mentioned even the asymptomatic people. So how could that be combined in this global integrated combined effort?
Yeah, I mean, symptom tracking can be very effective, and this is part of our belief. We think that symptom tracking and contact tracing should live together in the same app. They can be especially useful for tackling the false positives. I'll get there in 1 second. I just want to mention regarding the false negatives that there's a recent paper on Nature magazine that estimates that up to 60% of all positive cases are asymptomatic. So this is again one of the doubts around contact tracing. I mean, if up to 60% of people won't even register in the app, like their infection state, then it creates a doubt around the contact tracing. But regarding false positives, this is also a big concern, because Bluetooth version 4 has a range around up to 100 meters, and Bluetooth 5 up to 400 meters. In reality, Bluetooth is expected to work around the range of 20 to 30 meters, but that's still too long. That's a long range. And let's say we are talking with someone on the other side of a window. So in that case, the contact tracing will register that contact. But there's no way of someone infecting another person from the other side of the window. So that could potentially generate a false positive. Let me give you another example. Let's see this in the perspective of companies. Let's say someone works in a factory, and there's, I don't know, 50 persons working at the factory, and they spend like 8 hours together. So if they are all using contact tracing, if one of those will trigger as an infected, as a positive case, then all of those persons will be isolated. And my question is, who comes to work in the next day? No one. So here, the possibility of generating a high number of false positives can completely stop companies. And this is a concern. So we have to tackle false positives, which I come back to the question from Andre. He mentioned the symptom tracking. I think that, so the way it works right now with contact tracing is when the mobile app registers a contact with someone else, it also registers the amount of time that you spent with this in the proximity of this contact, and also it estimates the distance in which you were in regards to the other person mobile phone. So, and the risk calculation is merely based on this. So based on the amount of time and the estimated distance. So in my perspective, this will generate a large number of false positives. So if we combine symptom tracking, we might have a chance, because we can cross this information with the recent history in the symptoms of the person, and this doesn't solve every case out there, but at least it will eliminate some of the false positives. Because if you confirm that the person has an evolution in the symptoms, then you can be more sure. You can be more sure that this is not a false positive, and you can factor that in. And I think we can use other things like working. Instead of just signaling that you should be tested, maybe you could do something like, you should call this number, and some human on the other side of the line could, with epidemiologic knowledge, could factor all of these things and decide whether or not a group of people should be, or that person in particular should be isolated or not. So we need to think about this at length. And I think this should be done even before deploying the app. Because if we deploy the app as it is right now, the false positives might be overwhelming, and I'm concerned about that.
That's a great segue for you to go back to the guidelines, because it's about thinking about that app. Because this was a long parenthesis, you have been developing together with your colleagues and people from COVIDography and Tech for COVID-19 movement some of the guidelines for a Portuguese developed app for contact tracing. So can you continue, please?
Yeah, exactly. So so my parenthesis started when I was about to enumerate a guideline that had to deal with the application should be useful. So we need to make sure that if we are asking people's data, even though we are protecting that data and storing it in a decentralized fashion, we should only ask for data if we are at least confident that the app will work to some extent. So we need to solve the false positives and false negatives issues. I believe that we need to bundle the symptom tracking in the same application, and even add more useful information for citizens to encourage them to use the app. We need to study if we can reduce the range of the Bluetooth. I'm not entirely sure this will be technically possible, but if we could reduce the range to 2 to 5 meters, it would be much, much better than the current 20 to 30 meters. We may need to combine this with the centralized call center to make sure that we are tackling the false positives as well. We should also be careful with data minimization. This is a data privacy principle where you should only ask for like the data that you are really going to use in the application. You shouldn't ask for things just to store information for the sake of that, because you want to maybe use it later. In this case, we should make sure that we are only collecting the data that we need. We should roll out the anonymization protection, like random alerts, make sure it's decentralized so that the anonymization is hard. We also need to make sure that the solution scales. In order to scale, and this is quite complex topic as well, we need to bet on education. We need to explain to people in simple words what contact tracing is.
Digital literacy here, right? Also, not also about contact tracing, but also a little bit on digital literacy, right?
Exactly. So I think from last year, the stats is that only around 50% of all Portuguese have basic digital skills. So we are basically cutting in half the Portuguese population that would really know how to use an application like this, regardless of how easy we make it to use. So we need to pump up the education. We need to help, especially the elders, to teach them. We need to organize into volunteer groups to teach people that don't have digital skills. And this is generic. I mean, we just changed the whole paradigm of working. We are all enclosed into our homes. So people were basically pushed into becoming digital. So it's not just about contact tracing or a contact tracing app. It's about moving forward as a society. We need to make sure it covers as many devices as possible. And to that extent, I think the solution must be based on Apple and Google API, because otherwise it will be very difficult to reach the same range of compliance that they will provide us.
Exactly. Apple and Google combined, they are the only ones that can guarantee that we can have 60% or more, or whatever the proportion will be to make this truly effective, right? There's no other way.
Yeah, of course, but we also need to be careful about the other cases. People that don't have an Android phone or an iOS. Otherwise, we won't be an inclusive solution for.
And typically, this is elderly people. This is elderly
typically,
people that is the riskiest population out there.
Exactly. So I don't have a good suggestion on how we can do that. Maybe we can give away smartphones, but I mean, it needs to be figured out by the government and by
maybe this
society.
Is the population. This is the population where we do manual contact tracing, and that we are closer, and we get our workforce, human labor workforce, out there closer to those populations that are that might be less likely to have to own a smartphone with updated operating system and so on and so on. And then for everyone else, especially in big urban areas that have smartphones, iOS or Android driven, perhaps this could work. So again, the idea of a combined effort, not only contact tracing as a miracle that will solve all of this.
Exactly. That's a very good point, actually. Technology-wise, the solution needs to scale up to 10 million citizens, possibly. So it must be done with some caution. I believe that it needs to be built like a product, because it must have usability concerns, taking user feedback into consideration. It needs to be pleasant to use and easy to use. Otherwise, if we're just like force feeding a poorly built application to the public, we cannot expect good results out of it.
Yeah, there's lots to be done there on data visualization, for instance. The solution of data visualization will be very important, because that is the interface. That's what we will see. That's what will nudge our behaviors, and it is absolutely important, right?
Exactly. Almost at the end, I believe the solution needs to be resilient, and we talked about that earlier. I think it was a question from Pedro Matos, if I'm not mistaken. So the application should be protected. So the code that lives inside the mobile phone needs to be resilient against tampering attacks and leaking attacks. And resilient doesn't mean it should cover like 100% all the possible attacks, but it should tackle as many as we can. We should tackle also the fake applications problem. So it will be very likely that some malicious actors might be wanting to roll out like imitations of the app and just rolling that to app stores, or trying to somehow trick the users into downloading and installing fake applications. And that's a huge problem, and we need to help people. If that comes to be, we need to help them protect themselves against this type of phishing attacks. And finally, I think that this system, this application is so sensitive that we should, by all means, demand an independent privacy and security audit to the whole system, to make sure that it follows everything that we are expecting from it. Obviously, being open source and being developed in a transparent way will help that, but it needs to be more than that. Like specific, specialized professionals like security should audit this type of solutions.
So, as far as you know, what is the status here in Portugal? Who is really analyzing this? Is the government? Does the government have plans for this? What's the current status, as far as you know?
Well, we don't know much. It just has been announced yesterday or the day before. We now know that it has been commissioned to Ineshktech, and we know that it's called Stay Away app, and I don't know anything else. I mean, I'm just waiting, like everyone else, to know more details about this app. We hope we at Covidografia and all the other volunteers and people that are discussing this on the back, we hope that we can be able to somehow help think about what is really needed in this type of application in order for it to be useful and in order it to be safe and private by default, and not having to put trust in the government, not to do anything else with the data or to do the wrong thing. No, it should be protected by default.
There's lots of interesting questions and actually some discussion in our chat box regarding behavior. Behavior to feed the app and behavior that will be led, ignited, nudged by the app. Let me start with this last one, because it's a question that has been here from Andre Valente for quite some time regarding the kind of behavior that this kind of app might drive. Even in privacy-preserving contact tracing, can people not be chasing their neighbors in rural areas with lower population density to find out who their neighbors are, despite the anonymization of the data? Can this lead? I know you're not an expert in human behavior, but still, what do you think regarding that aspect? is there a real danger of suddenly we're chasing who are the infected, this kind of things?
Well, I think in the present times we are all not experts on human behavior, but I think we are finding out how humans behave in this type of situation. But yeah, so um, Andrea is referring to possible de-anonymization attacks. So if you just follow someone, you can actually take notes of whoever is in contact with that person. So that's a known attack. And it's feasible, but it's very costly because you need to follow that person every time. And the real danger comes not only from following one person, but from following many different persons and be able to cross that information between all those contact traces. So I don't think that following a person is a big danger for the system. It is a big danger for that person, and it should take care because it's being followed all everywhere. But this is an attack, if I may call it, that has existed since since we men follow other men for some reason.
And we have been seeing some really weird and dangerous behaviors as it is, even without apps for contact tracing, where people are trying to prevent hospital workers from sleeping in certain buildings and things like that because they're afraid of infection. So there's something there that the existence or non-existence of an app will not most likely have that kind of impact. And then a great discussion here between João Brunhosa and Rui Costa. João Brunhosa asking, should a gamification model be considered as a strategy to attract more users? So behavior to feed the app to increase the data that the app is able to collect, hence increasing its effectiveness. And Rui Costa replying to João Brunhosa, and I want to hear also your opinion. We have to be careful. We cannot create any social discrimination, negative or positive, between users that use and those that don't use the app. What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I believe the app should be neutral as much as we can, and that's really hard. That's really hard to design because there are already incentives on how to use the app. Let's say the app generates some false positives, and people generally know this. So they might avoid installing this app because they don't want to be closed at home and not be able to work. And there's a lot of people that cannot work from home. So it would have a negative economic impact on that person if a false positive forces the person to be at home. And this can lead to that person not wanting to use the app in the first place because they prefer not to know. Because if they don't know, they are not forced to be at home. So this is a good example on the difficulty of designing a neutral application. So we need to be discussing as a society all the possible negative impacts that a system like this might generate, and try to mitigate that through specific solutions.
We're really close to the end of our webinar. I don't resist on asking about the current status of Covidografia. What are the numbers that you get? How many people have been using it, and what kind of effect do you think it's having? What kind of data are we able to understand there? So, and please also a call for action for people to get on board with Covidografia.
So Covidografia right now is being used with roughly 65,000 people. As far as we know, there are a few symptom tracking applications out there, and it's the most used one, but still very far from the numbers that we would need in order to be more helpful. So we have been developing this, and we have been working with other groups in Portugal, working roughly in the same problem spectrum to be able to push this symptom tracking application forward. And really our biggest biggest challenge here is to engage with the government, and basically our goal as a group of volunteers is to basically donate the results of this project to the government and make sure it's being used. Right now, we are more or less on an intersection because we believe that contact tracing is the topic that is being discussed right now by almost everyone. And since we believe that symptom tracking and contact tracing should exist on the same mobile app, this is where we are trying to go for. So let's see what happens. Nevertheless, using COVIDografia provides data that can help the government discover how to better manage resources, what could be the next hot areas in Portugal in terms of the need for resources, for more confinement.
Just for our audience that hasn't seen COVIDografia, what do they do there, just so that they understand how simple it is.
You're right.
And how safe it is.
So symptom tracking is basically, that's what we do. It's basically, so it asks people to daily to insert their symptoms, their current symptoms every day, and their state of confinement. Are they working at home? Are they going out, etc.? And their and their status regarding the disease. Are they infected? Are they recovering patients? Are they healthy? And this is done on a daily basis. And using this information and aggregating this information, we are providing people with information about their area, about their postal code, and they can see how many people are healthy, how many people are suspect cases, how many people are in isolation. So they can have a sense about how their area is behaving regarding this problem that we have. But this is not the end of it. So we use this data. We expect to use this data to help the government figure out how to manage resources and to figure out how their previous decisions, if the previous decisions did well, if they had good results from it, and finally to help contact tracing be more effective and reduce the amount of false positives, to make sure that contact tracing can be useful for society, and that is a good idea to use it.
I don't resist you being also a scientist. It's not about the topic, but I don't resist putting you this last question. It has been a lot about getting data, having access to data so that scientists can really understand and support the decision making from the government, the technical health approaches, and so on. And there was a kind of weird discussion around here in Portugal about how that data is being made available or not, or how broad is the availability of that data, how controlled is that data, has the data been by the government. What do you think of this? Is the data, are the scientists, is science getting enough data as they should right now?
Well, I don't think so. At least that's what I hear from scientists, and we have been talking with many different scientists. I think that we need to make sure that we can share data without compromising privacy. This is what needs to be done. I believe that what is being done right now is, I sense that we are afraid of sharing data because we don't really know how to make sure that we can share it in a private fashion. So, and this is a solvable problem. I mean, we can gather people that work in privacy and security, gather those persons with scientists and the government, and we can figure out how we can share data that can be useful to fight the pandemic. And I think that the scientists are really starving for good data to understand this disease, because there's so many things that we don't know about this disease at this moment.
Pedro, we have reached the end of our time together. I really appreciate your availability. It was on short notice. We were on Facebook discussing a television program and that debated these topics without facts, truly without facts, based on lots of pre-assumptions and misconceptions. So I think it was the right moment. We need to go for the facts, go for the science of this. And this was very enlightening for all of us that are not experts in these issues. And we really need to figure out and understand by ourselves, because in the end, it will be about our behavior, how we will voluntarily join this kind of app, and the difference that it can make in our privacy and our security can be protected. So it was, I think, essential, and I thank you for clearing the facts to us, to presenting them in such a clear way. Thank you, Pedro. Let me. I will do here now a shameless sales pitch here, because lots of things that you were addressing. So data visualization and its importance. On the 9th of May at Porto Business School, we are having a masterclass with someone that I think is the leading expert in the world on data visualization. It's actually Portuguese, but he has been working for Google for quite a long time. Manuel Lima is giving us a masterclass on the 9th of May, Saturday, on data visualization and the tools for data visualization. He leads data visualization at Google, and which is absolutely cool. Mentioning the role of science here. This is an announcement. Next week, on Thursday, the 7th of May, we're having the rector of the University of Porto to talk about the role of science within all of this, and how science is becoming more collaborative, more open, which is kind of interesting. So 2 topics that we briefly mentioned here. And of course, next Thursday, we're having the Dean's Lounge here at 6 p.m. again on YouTube. The guest of our Dean is Francisco Veloso, the Dean of Imperial College London Business School. And he's talking about the role of entrepreneurship and innovation in this era, and how it's being affected, and analyzing the measures that have been implemented to support startups throughout Europe, in the UK, and here in Portugal. So don't miss the Dean's Lounge next Thursday. Don't miss any of the content that we're putting out there. And Pedro, once again, thank you so much. Stay safe. And guys, go to covidografia.pt. Pedro, thank you.
Thank you, Rui. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.